Greetings, Bermuda. My name is Aaron Hill. I'm joined again by my brother and good friend, Mr. Ryan Robinson, Perinchief. Ryan, how are you?
I can't complain, Aaron, and welcome again, as usual, to our viewers. This is the COVID-19 special series.
Well, you said you can't complain. I'm sure we all could right now. But as we start all our series, we'd like to take this time to express our sincere condolences to all those families who've lost loved ones during this crisis and extend our best wishes to those who are still recovering and fighting the virus. We also believe it appropriate to extend our deepest gratitude to the essential workers who are on front lines protecting us during this pandemic.
Absolutely.
Ryan, it's been a few days since we last met. We've had yet another press conference. We had some more releases. We've got an interesting guest, so we'll come to discuss that shortly. But what did you think about our last press conference?
Last night's press conference, it was interesting, it was really heartwarming to see Dr. Karika Weldon up on this stage. I don't think anybody can complain about having a young Bermudian in the room coming back to lend their expertise. I think that was definitely the highlight of last night's press conference. There were also some pretty interesting exchanges between you and the Premier and the Health Minister that I think we'd like to talk about once we finish with our guest. It sort of draws back onto our last show, which was on Tuesday. For those who were just joining us and weren't here on Tuesday, we had Dr. Kaiwan Brown as a special guest. We spoke a little bit about COVID-19 from a scientific perspective, as well as some of the testing. And then we also turned into government policy. So Dr. Kaiwan Brown spoke a little bit about his support for universal health care. And then we went a little bit deeper into how government is responding to the pandemic and some of the big extraordinary measures that need to be taken. So I think that was pretty interesting, Aaron. And speaking of extraordinary measures, one of the biggest things that have been impacted by COVID-19 is, of course, our tourism industry. So I'll leave it to you to introduce today's guest. Unless you have any other comments to add on last night, then I'll give it back to you.
Well, our guest today needs no introduction, really. He's been around for some time in a variety of fields. He is currently the interim CEO of the Bermuda Tourism Authority, and that is none other than Mr. Glenn Jones, who's going to join us on screen shortly. But we're interested, we'd like to remind our viewers that we do have the interim CEO, Mr. Glenn Jones, joining us today in studio. So if you have any questions we are live, and you can submit your questions in the live feed there, and we'll be sure to ask them. Mr. Jones, how are you?
I'm good. Good afternoon, gentlemen. I'm doing okay. I'm a little intimidated by the intellectual capital here. I hope I can keep up.
You don't mind if we call you Glenn, do you?
I don't mind, not at all.
Perfect.
People call me worse.
Ryan, go ahead. You can start off today.
Yeah, sure. Glenn, well, thank you for joining us. We know you're probably extremely busy, even though tourism isn't booming at the moment. We know that it's up to you as the interim CEO to help coordinate that response. We're going to jump right into it, if that's okay with you. How are you feeling, first of all? You took over as interim CEO. The announcement was made, and then a day later, it was officially declared a pandemic. What does it feel like to be the interim CEO, and how are you feeling right now, sort of taking over right at the start of this extraordinary crisis?
Yeah, it's an extremely stressful period, as you might expect. So there's no sugarcoating that. But all the time, we're really just thinking about the workers across the tourism economy who aren't at work right now. We are in a situation where our people can work from home. Sure, they're on reduced work weeks, but we can still get the job done remotely. But for so many people who are on the front lines of hospitality, they don't have that option. So they are completely out of work. And so every time that we're working on the recovery, it's really them that we're thinking about. 2,000 people in the hotel sector alone, thousands more if you think about restaurants and retail and transport and experience providers. So everything we do is really about getting those people back to work. And we can't wait for the opportunity to do that.
Well, we look forward to discussing a bit about your strategy for that today. And it's always good to know that you, as a person in top right now, are thinking about those persons on the ground who are working in the hospitality sector whose jobs have been affected. How are you feeling personally, though? How are you coping as interim CEO?
Well, it's a little counterintuitive that at a period where literally there are no visitors, I think all of us are working more hours. I'm doing, like a 60-hour work week, just talking to people constantly, whether it's the Chamber of Commerce or WEDCO or BEDC or the Corporation of St. George. strategizing our own teams, working with the ministry's tourism recovery group. So it is exhausting work. And it isn't only the hours, guys, it's also the fact that there's so much uncertainty around this. So we literally don't know when the end of this is. And if we did, it'd be easier to plan against that. But we are constantly revising scenarios. You know, we have a scenario where we get going again in June, and maybe one where we don't get going again until almost the fourth quarter. And we have to constantly adjust those scenarios from a budget perspective, from a marketing perspective. So it is difficult work. But I know it's going to be critically important to the community that we do this work well when the time is right to welcome visitors again.
Absolutely. I mean, you spoke a little bit about the uncertainty. The BTA, we've seen some recent press releases about sort of how the industry has been affected. Can you speak a little bit? I know we have some information here and some quick facts for the listening public. Can you tell us a little bit about how tourism has been impacted? What are the numbers?
Sure. It's a devastating impact, really. The numbers we put out this week are specific to the first quarter, so the period between January and the end of March. And you can see that leisure air arrivals, the metric that we care the most about at the Tourism Authority, was down 43.5%. I mean, that is really an unprecedented level of decline. Of course, around March 20th is when our airport closed, or at least stopped allowing commercial aircraft on a regular schedule to come in, and only residents were allowed back in. So at that point, there were literally no visitors coming in. But even before that, people were canceling their trips because they had a fear of what was happening with COVID-19. So that's a pretty devastating impact. And then you'll also see that there's a spending number there that shows that spending was down 38%. So that's money that will be spent all over the economy and people's businesses and their restaurants and their coffee shops. So that's a significant amount of spending that didn't happen in the first quarter that would have happened. And then when you start thinking about April 1st forward, the second quarter is likely to be more devastating than the first because it will be a longer period without visitors. So we are anxious to get the tourism economy going again, but we're also very mindful that we have to do it in a slow, safe, and responsible way, because the risk is doing it too soon and inflicting more damage by trying to do it too quickly.
Yeah. So, Glenn, what are some of the things that you think are going to reinvigorate or trigger this reinvigoration of our tourism industry? What are some new things? I don't think that we're going to be doing things the same. As you say, we've got to look at doing it slow. We've got to look at doing it responsibly and carefully. Bearing in mind that the whole world has been shut down for nearly in some parts months, and Bermuda's case just over a month. What are some of the things that you're thinking about at the BTA as to how do you make the Bermuda a competitive tourism jurisdiction?
So, well, first, I'll just walk you through what I think I've noticed as some interesting forced innovation that has happened because of COVID-19. And I know the first one, you guys will agree 100%, and that's businesses going online. Yeah. We've always advocated for that, and we think that that's a responsible way for any tourism jurisdiction to act, because so many visitors make their decisions about where to spend money before they get here. And if you don't have an online presence, then you are behind in the race. But many of our stakeholders have now been forced into an online environment, and I think there's going to be some legacy benefit for that post-COVID-19. So that's one positive. Another one you would have seen recently is that we have struggled to grow leisure air arrivals from the UK. And post-COVID-19, we are expecting that British Airways will fly to Bermuda from Heathrow as opposed to Gatwick. I know for some locals, Gatwick is the preferred airport, but from a visitor perspective, it's definitely Heathrow because of the connections that you can make across Europe. So that is something that we're excited to see how that matures post-COVID-19. But in terms of how we market to visitors going forward, that is going to be something we do very deliberately, because really everything has changed. Everything that we knew before in a lot of ways is not true anymore. And we think there are three things that we do well in Bermuda that will rise to the top of people's consideration list. We are clean, we are safe, and we are close. And I think for people who live in the Northeast, even for people who live in Canada, that's going to be very appealing in the immediate aftermath of COVID-19. As you might expect, being a clean destination and being a safe destination also does measure up in a lot of people's mind to say from a public health standpoint. And we think we can tell that story well. Also, Bermuda's always done well with repeat visitors. And I think that's where we're going to need to start immediately after COVID-19. People are going to want to go to some place that they know well, because everything feels uncertain in their life. And if we can appeal first to those people who have been to Bermuda before, many of them have a really, really positive, and we can invite them back. They know they can get here in a short amount of time. They don't have to spend a lot of time in a plane. We're confident we have a story to tell, but again, we can't get out there and tell that story until the time is right.
No, Glenn, you said a mouthful there. A lot of interesting ideas about how to reinvigorate tourism. I'm just going to hit back and ask you to allow me to pick your brain on just a few of the points you've made there. You mentioned British Airways coming out of Heathrow. Now, the UK has been one of the worst affected countries by COVID-19. It's great to hear, and I actually didn't think of that switching airports from Gatwick to Heathrow might give us a little bit of a boost. Has the Bermuda Tourism Authority factored in the possibility that British Airways and the UK might be one of the last places where we might want to be receiving visitors when things open back up?
Absolutely. In fact, I'll do you one better. Our number one market is New York City, and that is the epicenter of the global pandemic, right? So there's a lot to consider there. We are only as ambitious as public health guidelines will allow us to be. No one in our community wants to reopen to visitors in a way that puts our community at risk from a public health standpoint. So while I was explaining those opportunities to you, we have literally not spent $1 marketing Bermuda since March 16th, because we want every dollar we spend to be in a way that we know anybody who responds to that as a consumer is not putting our community at risk. So let's say, for example, we get closer to phase 4 in the government's reopening policy, and there is a decision made that there's a certain gateway city that we should not welcome visitors from, then the Bermuda Tourism Authority will know, well, that's not where we're going to invest what are now our limited advertising funds. We want to make sure we have everything cleared by public health officials before we get out there and start encouraging people to come back in this calendar year. We know ultimately we'll reopen everywhere, but we need to really focus right now on the places where we can get people to come to Bermuda in this calendar year, because generating that demand is what gets people back to work. And as I said earlier, that is our priority.
Now, you've mentioned the sort of tagline. It seems to be Bermuda's new slogan right now, based off of the recent report: clean, safe, close. Some people would argue that Bermuda was all of those three things prior to this current pandemic. How is this new strategy or campaign of clean, safe, and close, how is that bringing anything new to sort of Bermuda's marketing standpoint and perspective? And do you think that that is the best strategy for attracting tourists who perhaps either didn't consider Bermuda before, or even are considering it now but still aren't comfortable traveling?
No, that's an excellent question. So the brilliance of marketing is not only messaging, but it is timing. And I think those messages, those things, you're right, we've always been good at these things. But when you are telling that story is almost as important as what you are saying. So I guess the point that I'm making to you now, and I should relieve you of the notion that this is our new slogan. It's not necessarily our new slogan, but it is a way for me to clearly communicate what I think our advantage is for when we go back into the market. So being clean, safe, and close are going to be priorities, I think, in the decision-making post-COVID-19. It certainly will be my priority as a traveler. So you need to pick the right time to remind people of that. And that's really the nuance of effective marketing. It is not only what you say, but when you say it. When are people really open to hearing the message? And what I'm suggesting is post-COVID-19, this is a message they will be very open to hearing. And then just to take it a step further, I mean, you guys will have perhaps seen the video that our marketing team put out a week or two ago. And if you look at those images, it's really about telling a story that reflects our isolationism, right? I mean, just by being out here on our own in the Atlantic, there is a safety from a pandemic that people who live in a major metropolis don't have, right? So when you look at these images, they are about having lots of space. You and your loved one, the only one in the frame. In Bermuda, during the height of beach season, you can actually find a beach where only you and your loved ones are the ones there. And we think those are the kinds of images and storytelling that are really going to resonate, at least in the immediate aftermath of COVID-19.
Absolutely. Now, Glenn, I just want to pick your brain a little bit more on this current topic of clean, safe, and close. Now, you mentioned British Airways and the Heathrow flights. You've mentioned New York is one of the biggest markets, and we've mentioned clean, safe, and close, with emphasis on the close here. I'm seeing the current video that's up on screen is mentioning that we're 650 miles away from our closest neighbor. It seems to me that the Bermuda Tourism Authority is targeting those same markets of New York and the UK, as you've mentioned. Is this the right approach? Should we not be targeting completely different markets? Why are we focusing on sort of the same markets that we've attracted previously, particularly in light of the fact that those people in New York and UK are some of the hardest hit right now?
So at the moment, the truth is we aren't focused on any markets. We're going to have to make a decision about where to spend 2020 marketing dollars based on where the flights are going to be coming from. And I have to admit, at this very moment, we don't precisely know that. We certainly know which cities the airlines are interested in resuming service, but what we don't know is if our public health officials are going to be comfortable with service from those cities. But when they do tell us what those cities are, that is going to dictate how we spend the money. Because we're isolated and don't have a drive market, where the flights are coming from is critically important, and we're going to use that as our roadmap to decide where we spend the advertising dollars.
Sure. So, Glenn, can you tell us a bit about what the BTA has done in conjunction with the hoteliers? Bearing in mind that 2,000 Bermudians are now unemployed, out of work as a result of the COVID-19 shutdown. What discussions, if any, has the BTA had with hotels to, for instance, reduce rates for locals to be able to patronize them in the interim period before we start seeing a re-influx of visitors, air and cruise?
Yeah, so we are meeting regularly with the Bermuda Hotel Association. That's one of our main partners, and we're doing it in several ways. One way is from a sales and marketing standpoint, having constant communications with them about, selling the destination, but also about the trends of cancellations, right? How far out are people canceling their trips? What's the level of confidence that somebody who has a trip for the second half of 2020 believes that they'll still be able to take that trip? And I have to tell you, a lot of people are holding on until the very last moment to cancel because their ultimate hope is that they could still take the trip that they planned. So that's one way that we're working with the Hotel Association. Another way is in what we're referring to in our shop as inside out marketing. We're pretty convinced that the tourism economy is going to start reopening before our borders are open to visitors coming back, right? And so if that's the case, what role can we play to get people who are still earning an income right now to spend some of that income in market, especially if they had a trip plan that they're no longer able to take? And I think the hotels are very open to that prospect and are very much willing to work with us on that. So I think that is something that you're going to see coming down the pike. But you should know that before COVID-19, staycations made up a very, very small part of their overall business, right? And there's an opportunity here to change that, to really shift that. And if we can do it in an effective way, you're right, it does mean some of the people who aren't working right now would be able to go back to work. So that is definitely one of the areas that we're harping on. But it's not only going to be about hotels, right? It's going to be about golf. It's going to be about retail. It's going to be about boating. So all the things that are part of the tourism economy, how can we, in the short term, make it more attractive for local residents?
Sure, thank you for that. Ryan and I both know that the BTA has this excellent tourism experience investment program. Both of our youth groups have been beneficiaries of that program. What effect has COVID-19 and the shutdown had on the BTA's commitment with respect to some of the other, young Bermudians who have submitted proposals?
Yeah, so for the experience development team, that's one area where there has been constant readjustment. I'll give you a couple of examples. Late last year, Rum Punch Brunch was one of the started local experiences that we thought was ripe to inject into the visitor experience. And so we were working with that team a lot late last year and in January of this year to make the idea more attractive to visitors. And I think we were making a lot of progress. But then, of course, COVID-19 happens, and the events that they had planned for April and May are canceled, or in the case of the May one, maybe even close to being canceled. I'm not sure if it is yet. But that was one of the groups where we had to sort of put on hold what we were planning to do with them this spring because of COVID-19. Bermuda Carnival would be another example that we were planning to work with them in the first half of this year, and said, well, now we're in an environment where visitors literally cannot come to your event, so we have to pause it. And then eventually that group, the Bermuda Carnival group, canceled their event. So right now we're in another experience investment process where we have applications. We are having conversations with people as we speak. I was in 2 interviews yesterday, and we're trying to determine which of these events could still happen. And some people have a great idea that's going to be significantly impacted by social distancing. What does that mean? There are some ideas that could pause until the first half of next year. And can we work with people at that point when things have normalized a little bit? So we're still going through the process. We're making sure we're meeting those entrepreneurs who are out there with great ideas, but it's going to take a lot of creativity to decide how we weave those ideas into the tourism economy after COVID passes.
So from a financial perspective, how has this directly impacted persons who, for example, recently applied for the Tourism Experiences Investment Scheme? Is the BTA looking to sort of end some of those contracts, or what happens to those persons who were, let's say, in the process of developing something and then this situation is hit?
Yeah, we have a variety of areas that people are affected. So in some cases, you're right, there is a signed contract, but using a clause that's much like force majeure, the contract can be dissolved because literally there's no way a visitor could come to your event. In some cases, they're just paused, right? We're saying we're gonna press pause on this. We'd like to revisit with you after COVID-19 has passed and figure out how we can generate a new way going forward. And then for those who are applying right now, actually the application process for you got more difficult because there's also less funds to invest in this program for this calendar year. So it means probably that there will be fewer successful applicants in the second half of 2020 than there would be ordinarily, just because there's a strain on the budget.
Now, how do you balance that? I mean, you mentioned a little bit about how you think that the tourism industry is going to open up internally before it opens up externally. So how do you weigh up, if the BTA is, for example, canceling or putting some contracts on hold with local investors, with local experience providers, how do you sort of balance supporting local talent and local tourism ambassadors, and then at the same time, sort of managing the amount of funds that have been reduced by the BTA?
Yeah, I have to tell you, it's not easy work. I mean, in some cases, really good ideas will not get funded. I mean, that's just the reality of where we are right now. But one of the things that we do internally is at the start of every year, we have our strategic priorities. And those strategic priorities dictate how each of the divisions inside of the Bermuda Tourism Authority will operate. And of course, in March, April, we had to go through a period of revising those strategic objectives. So now we have new ones. And we will use that and balance it against the applications we have. What are our priorities this year, and how do these applicants help us execute on those priorities? The ones who do that the best will stand the greatest opportunity to be funded.
So we had, I think it was a week or two ago now, Ryan, we had Dion Smith, who's an entrepreneur here in Bermuda, but he also put on an event, the Caribbean Grand Prix Fitness Expo, which was in December, which is in our non-peak season ordinarily last year. He said that he, was able to attract probably over 300 visitors for an inaugural event. He was quite optimistic that he would still be able to have it. Are things like that, so particularly when we're looking at sports tourism in the off season, that's not our traditional peak season for tourism, is that something that the BTA is looking to get behind, particularly when we're looking at reinvigorating the way that we do things?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know much about that event, but it does sound like the kind of thing that we are very interested in. There's a health and wellness aspect that you're talking about there. It's yoga. I don't think you'd have too much trouble getting the physical distancing you would need in our new normal, our temporary new normal, I hope. So those are the kinds of things that we're looking at when we are evaluating which things we might invest in. And also understand, because sometimes this gets forgotten, these investment choices really aren't only about Bermuda Tourism Authority preferences, right? It's about which things have an opportunity to generate greater spending across our tourism economy. So which sorts of things are going to generate hotel room nights and spending in restaurants and spending on ground transportation and on and on and on. Because whenever we spend $1 on some of these investments, we're hoping it returns 7, 8, 10-fold into the overall economy.
No, exactly. Now, when we're now looking at how do we said this will be our temporary normal for a bit, right? Yeah. When we're looking at where do we go from here, and how do we invigorate it on a governmental level, right? And I'm going to ask you a question. I asked the Premier a few days ago whether or not this government, in light of the fact that we have seen the numbers that have just been released for tourism, will be considering new things, like, for example, a recreational cannabis market. That, in my view, and I know that there are many others out there, would do something different to the tourism market to attract the visitors. For example, if we open up our shores after COVID-19, post-COVID-19, where people aren't worrying about the travel and the like, but they know that the traditional Bermuda that they know that they can come to, plus there's a market, a $1 billion market. What is your view personally, and as well as the BTA? Are those some discussions that are being had now?
So I have to confess to you on that specific issue. I have not researched it myself, so I can't speak with any level of intelligence about what it would mean for our market. But I think your general premise is right. We should be thinking completely differently. There's an old political saying that you should never let a crisis go to waste. I think there's a way to apply that to tourism as well. Yes. There are some things that perhaps we should have done a long time ago. And now is a reset button where we can be courageous again, so that we can be out in front on some things instead of following. I'll tell you one simple example that the experience development team is following. And it's an idea that the visitor experience transactionally should be contactless. It should be increasingly cashless. You should be able to buy something without ever having to exchange cash or even touch the person that you're doing business with, right? So I think there's an opportunity in that regard alone to just make our whole tourism experience more frictionless, just having less touch points. And I think those kinds of innovations are going to be the things that visitors are really looking for post-COVID-19, because temporarily we do need to create some physical distance between ourselves as individuals. And if we can do things in our own businesses and in our own sort of economies that facilitate that, I think that puts us slightly ahead of our competitors.
Absolutely. I like the fact that you mentioned that we need to potentially do things differently, and that there are some things that we should have done a long time ago. Eron mentioned recreational cannabis. Now, we know that government had stated in the past that they were looking into this. You've accepted, and we appreciate that you personally haven't looked into it. But is it correct, or are you saying now that the Bermuda Tourism Authority hasn't had any discussion at all surrounding whether this would be something we might want to pursue?
I guess what I'm telling you is, in my brief tenure as interim CEO, I'm not aware of us looking into the issue, but you probably should not take that as the gospel across the 5 years of the organization. I just have to admit, I'm not sure. But I should tell you, we are open to looking at things that need exploration, right? And if this is one of them, then that's fine. I mean, let's go for it. Let's check it out. In fact, I had a meeting yesterday that was really, the title of the meeting was Bold Ideas. And we put on a page the things that we've had trouble getting done. Do we want to revisit them, or things that other jurisdictions have done well that we could probably do better? I'm not going to share with you what's on that list right now, but that is the way that we're thinking, because again, there's an opportunity that comes after a crisis passes, and we shouldn't be gentle about it. We shouldn't be tentative about that. We should be bold about that.
Absolutely. Eron, I know you have a few more questions, and I know our listening public do as well. So I just want to give a quick plug just to say thanks again, Glenn. We're about halfway through this interview. We know that you can't stay forever as you have work to do. I just want to let the public who are commenting, we're seeing a whole host of questions and comments coming in. We'll get to you in a minute. Keep them coming. We may have to restate a few. A lot more than we were expecting. So you're a popular man today, Glenn. I'd like to turn a little bit towards talking a bit about how the BTA as an organization has adapted. And then we can perhaps go back to the public, take some of those questions, and really get some conversation generated surrounding tourism and how Bermuda plans to approach this as a whole. So, Eron, I don't know, did you want to start with the questions on BTA?
Well, sure. I wanted to ask you, Glenn, a personal question with respect to, obviously, this is an amazing accomplishment. You're the interim CEO of the Bermuda Tourism Authority. From the perspective, I know much feedback that I've been getting, particularly with respect to tourism and how we brand ourselves, is that we're not looking at the Bermuda that some of us know as home. And what we see, for example, on the marketing efforts is not the Bermuda that we experience. Are we looking to potentially post-COVID-19 explore some more Bermudianized efforts like North Hamilton and the like to promote the, more ethnic groups? Particularly, you're the first Black, albeit interim president or CEO of the Bermuda Tourism Authority. You're the first Black CEO of the Tourism Authority. What does that bring to the table, particularly with your cultural roots and background?
So, I mean, I think part of what you're asking there is also about the economic power of Black travelers. And that is a market that, when putting together the National Tourism Plan, a project that I had a lot of leadership in, we discovered that we are under indexed in terms of the amount of African-American travelers, for example, that we attract to our destination. So when our plan was released in 2018, it is one of the things that we said we need to go out and do better at. I helped write the plan, so I'm in a position now to really affect change in that area, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity to do that. There's actually a team of people inside of our organization that are working on that very issue during COVID-19. So there are some people in our organizations whose roles cannot be fully executed when we're in the period that we're in now, and they are repurposing their efforts to work on this very issue. It's not the only issue that we've taken up since the crisis began, but it is one of the issues that we've started to actually put more time into, because there are fewer other things that need to be worked on at this moment. But you're right. I think a cultural, almost live like a local experience for visitors is something that people covet. It is that experiential experience that you get when you travel. So it is something that we're very much aware of, and I think there is a growth opportunity there. And I wouldn't even put this in the category of something we do post COVID-19 because everything is upside down. It's something that we really should just do. I mean, there's an opportunity there. It might feel good to the three of us because of our demographics, but it's also the economic right thing to do. Like, it's gonna be more spending, it's gonna be more visitors, and that's why we're really focused on it. It is the right economic play.
I'm glad you asked that, Eron, because I know that the BTA did in the past mention that they were attempting to engage with more African-American travelers. Now, Glenn, you did mention Black travelers. There's a lot of Black people in Africa and the Caribbean as well, but it seems like the BTA sort of has emphasized African-Americans. Is there any particular reason why Bermuda and Bermuda's Tourism Authority haven't reached out a bit more to sort of African countries or Caribbean nations to sort of get internal tourism going? Or what are some of the thoughts surrounding that? And what types of discussions have the BTA had when it comes to switching up the market a bit?
So on that point, I think we're led by the data. And the data says in our focus markets, as identified in the National Tourism Plan, there are 5 of them, I believe. And what we call nurture cities, there's another handful of those. If we look at just those markets, the amount of African Americans that live in those markets and the amount of African Americans who live in those markets who make over a certain household income, there's a huge opportunity just if we focus there. And the data would suggest that if we focus there well and are able to meet our 2025 goal of doubling the amount of African Americans who fly to Bermuda for leisure travel, we can win just there. I think the data showed us that we get about 4% of our leisure air visitors are African American. Our goal is to double that to 8%. And there is at least 8% in the markets that I was just talking about, our focus and our nurture cities. So for dollar, it just makes sense to invest it there because that's where we're more likely to win. If we had a bigger budget, or if we had the ring fence money that was for experimenting in the way that you were talking about, then it would make sense, I think, to spend it in those other places. But in terms of the goals that we've set, we should be able to meet those goals if we do well in the markets that I just talked about.
Now, sticking on the thread of attracting African American visitors, Eron alluded to this a little bit earlier. It's no secret, at least locally, that Bermuda's tourism industry and the way that we've marketed in the past has been somewhat controversial. There are many in the community who feel, for example, that only certain segments of Bermuda are represented, or that Bermuda, to some degree, has had its culture a bit attacked when it comes to certain areas. So sort of a whitewashing, if you will. In light of that, how would you respond, and how would you say that the BTA needs to move going forward if we're trying to attract African American visitors while simultaneously staying true to sort of our authentic brand? What types of marketing approaches are we taking here?
So another deliverable of the National Tourism Plan is to ensure that our marketing, our advertising, our images, the voices who are responsible for creating what we say about our destination is reflective of who Bermuda is. And I would hope that the criticism, or the constructive criticism that you were just talking about there, is muted now by the actions of the past 12 months or so, because I've certainly seen a representation in our marketing that I'm proud of, that I think represents who we are. There are probably areas where we can do better, but I think the basis of that criticism is from many years ago, and I think that those actions have been corrected over time. And I think we just need to stay on the track that we're on now.
Okay, thank you. We're going to turn in just a moment to some of the questions and comments, and we'll open this up and get some rapid fire questions fired at you. But before we do that, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the BTA as an organization. I know there was a recent announcement that the BTA has taken some pay cuts. There have been some hours cut. Can you tell us a little bit about how you as an organization are coping with this?
Yeah, again, it's not easy. It is very difficult, especially for an interim CEO who's only been on the job for a while, to have to communicate to his team that they have to cut back their work time. It was a decision that was made by our board. The management team obviously had the opportunity to influence that decision, but ultimately the decision is the board's. And so you're right, we are on reduced work weeks for much of the staff, not the management team. They're working sort of around the clock. But there are some people in our organization who are on a 4-day work week and some who are on a 3-day work week. And from the board's perspective, it was important to make sure that we continued our business continuity, and that we had some semblance of normalcy, as opposed to some people working no days a week, but some semblance of normalcy, so that we can still deliver on what our community is going to need once COVID passes. And that need is making sure that we're out there talking to the world, that Bermuda is open for business, that we're clean, that we're safe, and that we're close, and that we're welcoming visitors back again. Marketing will probably be never more important than it will be after this crisis passes, because without that marketing, people are not going to know about whether or not Bermuda is open to welcoming them again. And I think the management of this crisis has put us in a good position, because we can go out there with confidence, knowing that this country has managed the crisis better than many others.
Yeah, we've got some questions from our viewers. We're still live, and one of the questions is, worldwide islands and top tourism destinations are affected. What are some of the things that you as CEO have identified that these other countries are doing to raise money, and what can we do here in Bermuda due to our current limitations?
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. So what can we do to raise money for like sort of tourism projects?
So with respect to how do you see in your research how other jurisdictions are responding in comparison to Bermuda? And what are some of the things that we can learn from those jurisdictions?
I think for most of our competitors, most of our true competitors in the tourism industry, they too right now are closed to visitors. I mean, a lot of us are in the same boat. One of the things that we've been talking about in our tourism recovery sessions is about whether there's an opportunity for public health and transport officials in Caribbean destinations and Bermuda can align their guidelines and criteria so that airlines and visitors know, if you're coming to this part of the world, here are the guidelines across the board for all the jurisdictions. Early days yet, but I think that might be one effective way for the whole region to come back and communicate a message to visitors about the level of safety that is in place to protect them and to protect our communities from the pandemic.
You mentioned our competitors. Sorry, Eron. You mentioned our competitors, and then you also spoke to some of the things that the Caribbean as a region can do. Some might say it's a bit unusual because it's sort of a contrast there, right? You know, we're talking about our competition, and then we're talking about working with them. To that end, in what ways has the BTA in the past coordinated with other Caribbean nations or perhaps our competitors?
It's it doesn't happen often. We have like economies in that for much of the Caribbean, tourism is a major pillar. So there are organizations like the Caribbean Hotel Association and others where there's an exchange of ideas. But you're right, for the most part, we are competitors. In some cases, we're competing for the same visitors. But the one way in which Bermuda is very different is that our seasons are different. And for travelers to the Caribbean and Bermuda, the weather is a huge part of the decision making. So there are some parts of the year where visitors are not considering us as the same time that they're considering, say, Barbados or Bahamas, because the climate is just completely different. So a February there looks a lot different than a February here. And someone who's trying to decide between one and the other, if beach and sand is your preference, you're probably not going to choose Bermuda in that equation, right? Because we don't have that experience in February.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, and the thought came to me because I was browsing social media, and there was a young man by the name of Shamari Talbot who mentioned, sort of how the cruise lines have been impacted. Now, as we know, the Caribbean region as a whole, we take up a large amount of the cruise ship visitors, and all of us as a variety of countries have been hit one by one with the lack of cruise ship arrivals. And his suggestion was, have we considered, for example, partnering with some of those cruise ship companies, or perhaps starting our own cruise ship company in partnership with the other Caribbean countries? We've seen that you have, for example, Caribbean Airlines, which hops from different countries. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. Can Bermuda be a bit more collaborative in those ways to, for example, spark a new industry?
So on cruise lines, you're right. I mean, that's an industry that has been really decimated. I mean, we talk about our tourism industry, but the cruise line industry as a whole is really, really struggling. I'm really not sure what it looks like after COVID-19. That is very, very difficult to imagine. I should also mention, I mean, we've had, I believe it's 67 confirmed cancellations for our cruise ship season this year. And that is devastating to many small businesses that rely on the volume that the cruise ship season brings. So we were talking about hotel sector earlier. That sector that relies on cruise ship passengers should not be forgotten either, because although cruise ship passengers spend a relatively small amount of money when compared to air passengers, on volume, they really do have a big impact on the many small businesses. So those people are really going to be feeling the pain this year as well. And I don't expect that, 67 is going to be the last cancellation that we see. There'll probably be many, many, many more. But to your point about thinking outside the box as it relates to the cruise ship industry and the airline industry, yes, we are certainly doing that. We have lots of partners in that conversation as well. The Ministry of Tourism and Transport and Skyport and Bermuda Airport Authority, certainly WEDCO, which relies heavily on cruise ship passengers. So there are lots of conversations to happen in that regard. Where we land, I'm not sure, but the cruise ship industry is going to be really, really hard pressed to get started cruising from the United States again. So what does that mean for us? Is there a different way for the Atlantic and the Caribbean waters to be filled with cruise ship passengers again? And then a step beyond that, are the communities here and in the Caribbean ready to welcome cruises back again? Because that's a question that needs to be answered as well.
Thanks. Delsina Bean Burrows asks, what are your thoughts about rebuilding the tourism industry by way of virtual tourism?
So I think that's only a short-term fix, I'm afraid. I mean, I think our marketing team, our digital team, has done a really good job of keeping Bermuda top of mind through virtual tourism, right? Bringing people to Bermuda through their computers or through their phones. So they've done an excellent job of that. But I don't think that that vehicle helps us out of the joblessness mess that we're in. What's going to be required there is visitors returning to our shores. So I do see a usefulness for virtual tourism to keep people excited, to keep people dreaming about Bermuda, but ultimately that's just a means to an end of getting people to come back to Bermuda again.
So I know that you've got to go shortly. Ryan and I have been having discussions on shared sacrifice. That's been something that the government has talked about. The Premier has discussed it at the various press conferences. We know that the BTA has made some cuts. Can you tell us a bit more about that with respect to your pay cuts?
Sure. Yeah. The board put out a press release on this last month, but I can tell you, generally speaking, that with the work week reductions that I was mentioning a moment ago, where people are on a 3-day or a 4-day work week, it means that their salary has been decreased equal to the amount that they're working less. So if you consider a 5-day work week at 100%, if you are now working a 3-day work week, it means that your salary has been decreased by 40%. And if you are on a 4-day work week, it means you're working 1 day less, so your salary has been decreased by 20%. For the senior executives of which I am a part, they are also on a salary reduction, but no work week reduction. So that was the ultimate decision from the board about how we remain productive while also sharing our sacrifice with the industry that is really, really struggling right now.
Are those cuts at the same rate for example, if you're working overtime and getting a reduction, and then some of the non-C-suite, I guess you can say, staff are cutting back on their work weeks? What are some of the rates and how has that specifically impacted them?
So I think what you're asking, so for the senior executives, they are not working less, but are on a salary reduction.
Right.
So really,
sort of specifically, how have they been reduced? Because the way that I'm thinking is, for example, with our essential workers, right? In a crisis like this, they are working overtime because they know that they have to compensate for other areas where there is an activity taking place. So if, for example, your everyday BTA staff member is taking a work week reduction and a wage reduction, I'm wondering how that impacts their ability to sort of deal with the recovery plan in comparison to, for example, C-suite executives. So I'm trying to gauge how specifically have they been impacted as far as pay in comparison to, for example, somebody like you as interim CEO, and how do you think that will impact their ability to stay motivated and sort of revive our economy?
Right. So I understand the question better now. So I mean, I think by and large, we've operated pretty well. It is hard from my seat to see that we're missing a beat. There's a level of predictability that you can build in when you know what people's work schedules are, right? So we can ensure that the talks we have we have a group in our shop called Stakeholder Support Task Force, right? So we schedule those meetings on the day when we know everybody who's part of that task force can be there. So it does require you to overmanage a little bit to make sure you're structuring everything right and you're thinking far enough in advance. But I'm satisfied that thus far we've been able to do it in a way that we are still effectively achieving our proper mission, which is making sure that on the first day of recovery, we are ready to get out there and do everything we can to grow demand and to get people coming to Bermuda this calendar year.
Well, we appreciate your time. I know as we're wrapping up here, you got 5 minutes before 4:30, because I do want to get you off. We've got one more question. It says, do you think that additional measures should be in place beyond the 3-month unemployment window to assist, for example, airport workers, servers, and bartenders, since they are the last persons to go back to work in phase 4? I know that's not a decision of the BTA today, but as a tourism executive, what is your view on that?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. First, I should say the government was swift in its assistance for people in the tourism industry and across our economy to step up with unemployment benefits. And that's something that we, loudly applauded. That was something we really needed in order to just relieve some of the pressure out there for people in the tourism workforce. But I also understand that it's not sustainable to have this go on forever. And ultimately, you want those people to be off of unemployment benefits because they're going back to work. But I think the nucleus of this question is, what if we are at the end of the unemployment benefits period, but not everybody can go back to work yet? And that is a difficult question to answer. What I hope is that there is an understanding among senior government officials that we think an investment in the tourism recovery, so an investment in marketing tourism when it's safe for visitors to come back, is the safest way, the surest way to get many of those people off unemployment benefits. Let's keep in mind that those 2,000 hotel workers before COVID-19 were not an expense burden for the government, but now they are because unfortunately they're on unemployment benefits. The best way to get them off unemployment benefits is to start the tourism recovery again, because then those people go back to work. And not only are they no longer an expense burden on taxpayer dollars, they become a source of revenue because they're paying payroll taxes. And I think that's the economic equation that we need to step into soon as it's safe to welcome visitors back again. We are working very, very hard to make sure that we are saying the right message to the right people in the right markets who might make a decision to come to Bermuda this year. If we're able to do that part effectively, that is the way we get people off unemployment benefits, instead of looking for ways to extend unemployment benefits, which is totally unsustainable and doesn't allow those workers to become a source of revenue instead of an expense.
Sure. And as we close, I thank you for your frankness with respect to the question regarding the cannabis industry. I know that a lot of our viewers and a lot of our people who are tuned in are keen to know, well, what exactly are we doing to reinvigorate it? I appreciate your frankness.
I have a feeling, Eron, that you're going to send me lots of things to read so that the next time you ask me this question.
Well, then it's actually, I'm looking at the comments here as well. And it seems a lot of people, there is quite a buzz around it. And we know that, for example, Bermuda's tourism strategy in the past has received quite a lot of criticism for not being innovative enough or not thinking outside the box enough. So it's good to hear that you're committed to sort of looking into those things while you're here incoming into this role. And I think that's a good segue as we begin to close, Glenn. How exactly, what do you have to say to the Bermudian public? Because some would say that tourism was struggling a little bit before this pandemic. We're trying to revive it now. We've seen some improvements since the creation of the BTA. We've seen some of these statistics released. People are wondering, if we were having some challenges before, and you're saying that we need to start looking at things differently and doing some things perhaps that we weren't doing before. What are your sort of parting words? How are we as a country, how are you as the BTA really going to take on this challenge and get tourism back again?
So my confidence in our ability to get tourism back again is because we were on the road to doing that very recently. As you mentioned, trouble in tourism has been a problem for a generation. And here in the last, 4 to 6 years, let's call it, we started to see a turnaround. And it was gradual at first. It was slow at first. But I think anybody who looks at a chart that shows 20 years of tourism performance will see things were trending upward or trending in the right direction here in the last few years. So I think we can replicate that. It's going to require an immense level of buy-in across our community. It's going to really require sort of a can-do spirit, a spirit that requires we never feel like we can be defeated. But as long as we have that, I think it's entirely possible to wage the comeback that was only recently underway. As I said before, the other reason I'm confident is because failure is really not unacceptable. We have thousands of people right now who are out of work. We have probably hundreds of entrepreneurs who saw the comeback in tourism and invested their livelihoods to be part of that comeback, so that they are not only employees in the tourism economy, but they own a piece of it. So for all of those people, whether they are entrepreneurs or tourism workers, we have a responsibility to bring this thing back for them. And as long as we keep that in the forefront of our minds, or at least it's in the forefront of mine, that is enough motivation to keep me going at this, even though it is extremely, extremely difficult work, as you can imagine. But like I said, failure is not an option. Those people who are out of work right now, those people who invested their livelihoods in tourism, they need this to turn around, and we have to be there for them.
We're at a stage, and I've got to let you go. I've said that for 10 minutes now. I'll let you go. But this is our last thing. We're at a stage now where some people might look at the position that you're in and they don't want to be in it. You're interim CEO for now. Is this something that you see yourself fulfilling in the full-time position? Do you want this job, particularly when we're at this, unprecedented time in our history?
Can you ask me that later, after we've gotten to the end of the crisis? Some days, Eron, are extremely long. Some of the problems do feel unsolvable, and I could probably answer that question after I know the life of this crisis. But I'm in it at least that long. I can tell you that with certainty. And if I feel like I can survive after this, I will throw everything I have in making sure that I have a shot at being the full-time CEO. But I'm going to have to take this one day at a time, man. It is really, 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 really rough trying to figure this thing out.
Well, we appreciate your time. We're going to let you go. Again, this has been the interim BTA CEO, Mr. Glenn Jones. Thanks again, Glenn, for your time.
All right. Thanks very much, guys. Thanks, everybody, for watching.
Well, Eron, that was very interesting. I really appreciate interim CEO Glenn Jones taking the time out to allow us to pick his brain. I mean, he told us at the beginning, don't go easy on him. And I think we got some pretty good questions in there, some pretty good food for thought. What do you think?
Yeah, I appreciate his frankness. I appreciate, his candor in that regard. Even with respect to asking him whether or not he wants the position. And the reality is it's an unenviable position to be in right now. Particularly, when tourism is taking such a large hit as it has. So I wish him the best. I know that Glenn's, up for the job. So we'll wait and see. As he said, we got to take it day by day, because much of the decisions and much of the things that we're asking of him can't realistically happen until we get past this hurdle. So much kudos to him. We're grateful for him spending nearly 45 minutes with us today.
That was a pretty thorough discussion, and the public seemed to be very interested, particularly in tourism. I mean, there were over 2,000 Bermudians working in the hotel and tourism sector, so it's certainly a hot topic. And as Keontae, one of the commenters, pointed out, when you look at the phases that the government has put down for reopening, hospitality is last. So not only have they been hit the hardest, but they're also going to be the last likely to recover. So, I mean, it was great to be able to talk to him, and we'll have to see where we go from here. So just for the listening public, for the last segment of our shows, we normally spin a little bit and talk into sort of government's response and the press conferences, and Kenneth Island Empress Burgess.
That's one of our usual commenters. You got to get her name down.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry, Kenneth. I've got your name right. Island Empress Burgess left a pretty good comment, which I think sums up sort of what Glenn was referring to and what the other commenters were referring to, which is tough times call for leaders to always think outside the box, be creative, research, rely on key stakeholders' input, and rely on non-traditional methods, and listen to ideas of the people. Thank you so much for that, Kenneth. I think that's something that Eron and I have been talking about since we started this series. What do you think, Eron?
Yeah, I mean, that was the premise of the question of Glenn there with respect to the cannabis market. Is we've heard them double down on some of the things that they've been doing historically, over the past few years. But what I didn't hear, at least not yet, and understandably so. We're in the middle of a pandemic. But I just wanted it to be important, or I thought it important for him to be taking that back to the BTA, back to their board to say, okay, how do we do things differently? I think post-COVID-19, nothing is going to be the same. And so we've really got to be looking outside the box. I think, again, that was a great comment from Kenneth, but that was the importance of some of the questions that I asked of Glenn, particularly when we're looking at the cultural aspects. Some feedback that I was getting as I shared with Glenn was that as you put it, whitewashed, that the Bermuda marketing is whitewashed and that doesn't represent the true culture of Bermuda. So we would like to see, a bit more influx. I know that we've got, when we look at the difference of the Bermuda Instagram page that's run by the BTA as compared with some of the Instagram photos that we see on like the young entrepreneur Jade Gibbons' website, Kingdom Heights.
Exactly.
And so looking at the balance there, you wouldn't think that they're the same place, and so let's get some balance. Yes, they're both Bermuda, I mean, it goes to that notion about the two Bermudas, but that's another conversation in and of itself.
I think it ties in a lot, not only to the questions you were asking Glenn, but also questions you asked of the Premier. I remember on Tuesday's show, we talked about some of the extraordinary measures that may need to be taken in the aftermath of this COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the things that you highlighted was that if there was ever a time to reset everything, to do things differently, to take drastic steps, it was now. I mean, I was speaking with a young lady today who's trying to launch a new business, and she was talking a bit about government's response, and she was saying, look, we have nothing to lose anymore. What are we waiting for? We have to start doing things that we said we were going to do this whole time. So Glenn seemed pretty receptive to that, and I appreciate that he's going to take that feedback back to BTA.
One thing I really appreciate about him is what we've seen, for example, or what I've seen particularly at the press conferences is, I've got to provide an answer because the question was asked. But realistically, as Glenn conceded there, hey, I've not done the research as best I would to be able to give a proper comment on it. It's something that I will entertain, and I appreciate that candor. I appreciate that honesty and that frankness there. So hopefully we can see that across the board.
Absolutely.
But moving on to some of the topics that we discussed last week, we had a rather heated debate. I thought it was very thought-provoking debate on, everything being on the table with respect to some of the questions asked of the Premier. What were some of the questions that stood out to you from last night's press conference?
Well, Eron, on Tuesday's show, we talked a little bit about private business and how they're coping. We had a discussion because there were some of the bigger companies. I mean, the biggest issue that I think you and I have been talking about, and our biggest concern, maybe even our biggest fear, is that government has spent at this point over 15 million in unemployment benefits to Bermudians who are out of work or being laid off, who are struggling to pay their bills right now. A lot of those funds are going right back into the hands of the typical traditional business owners. And so the question that you asked on Monday night was of the Premier and the government was, what extraordinary measures are you going to take? Are you planning to legislate? What are you going to do to help ease some of the pain that's being inflicted on our working class people right now? And I know that the Premier was pretty stringent in his response. Even before you asked that question, we saw a little tit for tat between the governor of Bermuda and, for example, Butterfield Bank. And the Premier said that he thought that the government of Bermuda specifically, yeah, sorry. And there was a bit of a tit for tat back and forth between him and Butterfield Bank as it relates to his suggestion that private businesses could be doing more to help. And so when you asked me what questions stood out, I think you continued along that similar thread, because Butterfield responded after that and they said, we think we're doing enough. And so you asked the Premier, well, Premier, you've respectfully asked private business to step up a bit. Private businesses have responded and said they think they're doing more than enough. What are you going to do now? I'm wondering what you think about his response.
Well, I don't think it was a response, and that's just as simply there. It didn't answer the question. Particularly, it was everything's on the table. We're considering everything. It was. I mean, and a large part of some of the responses start off with that question's been asked many times before, and the point of the question being re-asked is because we haven't received a sufficient answer. I know that the Premier said that tomorrow legislation will be tabled in the House of Assembly to give effect to allowing some individuals to access their private pensions up to the amount of $12,000. That was something that he referred to as an extraordinary measure. And I do believe that it is extraordinary, but one has to question whether it's a good extraordinary or a bad extraordinary. And if it is the only extraordinary measure available to this government at the time, I don't think that it is. One of the responses that stuck out to me, and particularly a lot of the feedback that I'm getting, is when the Premier said, I'm not going to make policy during this press conference. Well, I don't think that anybody was asking him to do that. I think we were asking what What are the policy decisions that you're having that you have not been having prior to COVID-19, recognizing that we're not going to be in the same place? What are those discussions? When I asked, for instance, with respect to the fact that Butterfield Bank had doubled down on their response in saying, well, listen, the reason we've got lower interest rates in Cayman as opposed to Bermuda is because your government's debt is 5 times that of Cayman. Your growth is substantially less than that of Cayman. And so we based our decision on that. Whilst we did reduce it, we couldn't reduce it on the same scale. Now, whether or not that's excusable is going to vary based on the individual that you ask. But the point is that the premier made a statement that he was going to give these institutions like banks an opportunity to work with individuals. We've heard this thing about guidelines that the government is releasing. Those guidelines are non-binding. So my question was really in response to the fact that they've simply said, well, yeah, we heard what you said, but this is why we made the decision. Will you legislate a reduction in interest rates? And the response to that was what?
Well, it seemed a little bit like Butterfield is putting his feet to the fire. And I say that because what we've had, when you look at the timeline, the premier said last week, private businesses, if you don't step up, we as a government are going to look to legislate. If you won't do it, the sort of thread was, if you don't voluntarily do more than you're doing right now to sacrifice, we're going to make you by way of legislation. Butterfield, stood right up to him and said, look, we've done enough. We're not doing any more. So when you asked last night, well, you've seen Butterfield's rebuttal. They don't agree with you. What are you going to do now? Are you going to actually implement legislation? Because that sort of was the warning that was given. The premier said that he didn't think that legislation would necessarily always be the right way. So I thought it was interesting because I was hoping to at least see at least one legislative thing that he might do, which would affect the private businesses. We've seen the extraordinary measure, like you said, about pension contributions, but for the premier to say something, a week ago, which was, you need to do more or I'll make you do more by way of legislations. And he specifically said legislation. And then when you asked him, well, what legislation are you going to do now that they've said they're not going to follow your advice? And he responded by sort of backtracking a little bit by saying that he didn't think that legislation was always the right way.
It wasn't a little bit. It was quite a roundabout turn. It was, first of all, if you don't take action, we'll take the action. When asked what action, or if you're going to take legislative action, well, maybe that's not the right resolution to the problem. Well, that begs the next question. What is the appropriate response? How do we reduce the interest rates? And how do we do it quickly? Because the Bermudians that are struggling to pay their mortgage as a result of the fact that the banks aren't prepared to reduce their mortgage rates by that much, they may not have the benefit of 5-6 months time. The reality is that these 3-month deferrals that the banks are doing, they're still going to come for their funds. And so when I'm asking these questions, it's not to catch him out. It's really because I'm genuinely interested to know, as are much of the public, interested to know what is the plan. We keep hearing what appears to be empty threats.
And I think that a lot of the people have been quite supportive of the premier when he makes such statements. He's encouraged private businesses to step up. The public are backing him in that regard, as far as we can see, particularly with our feedback and our comments on the Burn News series. And so for me, I would encourage the premier to continue down that path, because if private businesses have their own people who defend them and their own advocates, and the people are being advocated for by the government who's saying, hey, private businesses, you need to step up. It's a loss for not just the premier, but for all of us if, they call him out on this and he doesn't respond to it. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing what types of legislation the premier is going to bring forward tomorrow. We're definitely, as we know, there's no press conference tomorrow, but we'll be back here on Tuesday to discuss. And I'm hoping that we'll see something a bit more than just the pensions.
Well, I think he made abundantly clear that that's what we will see tomorrow. There's no mystery legislation that's coming, so I wouldn't hold your breath on that one. But hope springs eternal. One of the things that, even when we're discussing with Glenn, I think that it's important to note, and it's not personalized to individuals, but it's important to note that what we're seeing across the board is the same thing. I asked the premier, for instance, the young Bermudians who are graduating this year and returning home, looking to enter into the economy, what is the plan for them, seeing as they won't qualify for an unemployment benefit because they were never employed to begin with? Well, the response to that was, we're going to continue our summer employment program. that is the same thing that has happened. And it doesn't deal with the fact that now you're dealing with an influx of graduates who otherwise would not ordinarily be a part of the summer employment program, but for the fact that some of the private entities are not hiring. And so what we're seeing really, and then when you look at, for example, the BTA's message so far, because they're reanalyzing, as Glenn said, day to day, it's taking it day by day. But reality is the message that's being promulgated into the public now and up to our overseas jurisdictions that we cater to is the same thing. Bermuda's a clean, responsible, safe place to be. Well, that's been our message for a time. What is going to be different? And that, I think, is a question that has to be asked across the board. And as we have our guests, that's one of the things that we're asking them. What are you going to do that's different?
And I think it goes back to what Kenneth's comment was earlier. You know, we have to look at doing things radically different, and that starts from the top. Now, what I'm thinking about also is, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because we saw at the outbreak of this pandemic that a lot of people were talking about the need for unity. And they said, you know, we're all unified right now. We've seen different symbolic gestures. We've seen private businesses work together with government. We've seen the opposition leaders sit at the same table with the premier. And everybody is sort of touting this message of unity and togetherness. But when you look at the reports and you look at the papers and you see this tit for tat that's been going on between private businesses and the government, I'm starting to question whether we've passed or whether we ever were in that unity phase. You know, perhaps we were unified when we were just protecting ourselves from this virus. But now that money's involved, we're seeing people go hungry. We're seeing bills due. We're seeing mortgages, you know, at risk of being called in because people can't afford to work anymore and pay their bills. Where was this unity? And so I'm really interested in seeing how this plays out. I mean, what I'm looking at particularly, Eron, is we've seen in recent days the battle between, for example, Butterfield Bank and the Bermuda government. But at the same time, just the other day, 2 days ago, the parent company of Belco announced that they had $3 million more in this quarter than they did last year at the same time. So I know, for example, Belco has implemented bill deferral payments, but their profit for this first quarter was 4.1 million compared to 1 million last year at the same time. They've said plain and clear, hey, we're doing good. We haven't been affected too much by this pandemic. And so whilst the debt relief is great, and certainly they didn't have to do that, it was a step, we have to wonder, you know, could private businesses be doing more? That's certainly what the premier said. And now that we've accepted that, well, what's going to happen? Are we going to just continue to sit by and wait for the premier or hope that there's some sort of legislative measures that are going to be taken to sort of ease the burden when private business right now is they have their foot on the gas? They're saying, look, we're doing good and we're pressing on forward. So at what point do we step up? That's what my question is.
No, and I think it's important, particularly for our listening viewers, to understand that these discussions, the questions that I asked at the press conferences, from where I sit, are not really for the premier. I don't anticipate, and I'm more pessimistic than some others. I don't anticipate that some revolutionary measures are going to happen overnight. What it's going to take is the voting population recognizing that we have to apply that pressure to our elected officials. We have to demand the change. We have to say, hey, look, we need to do something different, because I can't criticize a private business for doing what private businesses do best, protecting and promoting their interests. We have to look to the government, our elected officials, who have a duty, a moral duty. And this is what they undertook to do when they ran for the election, that, hey, look, we're going to do the revolutionary things. We're going to do things different. We're not going to do things the same.
Because you keep using this phrase revolutionary, and I think that's part of the issue, Eron. Is it really revolutionary? I mean, I think that's perhaps some of the concerns, right? Is that some of the things you're suggesting, some people think that that's a radical extreme step. So when you say things like, you know, what revolutionary measures are we going to see? I think we have to question that. And I have to question you. Is it really revolutionary in the middle of a pandemic for a government to legislate, for example, debt relief or debt forgiveness? I don't think so. And when we phrase it as revolutionary, it sort of scares people, and I think unnecessarily. Is that really revolutionary or crazy? I don't think so.
Well, I think when you really look at the fact that the resistance we're meeting, the obvious answer to that is it must be. Why haven't we taken that step? You know, we can argue the semantics of, okay, is this a step that it has to be? It is historically, this is historically not how we've operated. We've not stood up to private businesses. That is a revolutionary step, I would say. It's not something that we've seen. Point to it in our recent past. I'd ask you.
No, but I don't think that's the question to be asked. What I'm thinking of is our conversation on Tuesday, right? You asked the premier, what extraordinary measures is the government going to take? And his response was, it's extraordinary that we've paid out over 10 million in unemployment benefits, right? It's extraordinary that we've had to restrict constitutional rights. But when we spoke on Tuesday in reflection on that, we said we didn't really think it was that extraordinary for government to do that, even though it's extraordinary in the sense that it's unusual. It's certainly not extraordinary in the sense that it's unexpected or unjustified, because that was what we said and agreed was the bare minimum response of government. In that particular scenario, it may have been crazy to think a year ago, perhaps, the government would pay out 10 million in benefits, but given the current times, it's a proportionate response. So I understand what you're saying as well, but my concern is that phrasing it as revolutionary suggests that perhaps maybe it's not justified or that it's extreme, when really the conversation is
revolutionary principles.
A proportionate response. I think it would be proportionate. So yeah, I agree with the semantics part, but I wanted to point that out because you can have somebody who doesn't have quote unquote radical views that could really look at this situation and say from a logical, rational perspective that it's quite proportionate and that government's response right now has perhaps been insufficient, right? And therefore disproportionate. So doing something like debt forgiveness or legislating changes to private businesses might very well not be radical or revolutionary. Rather, it might just be something that helps to bring a balance to what is currently an imbalanced situation in favor of private businesses and against the working class citizen.
Perhaps. I mean, again, I think we're going around in the semantics aspect there, particularly from when we look at it. Where have we seen in Bermuda or other jurisdictions where you're mandating or legislating a reduction in the interest rate? That is peculiar in the extreme. But the point to be made here is that these are extreme times. So yes, I don't think that takes any aspect away of whether or not it's a radical decision or whether or not it's a revolutionary decision. I think that it is. It's never before seen in Bermuda. When you look at our counterparts, other jurisdictions within the Caribbean, where have we seen the actions that we're proposing take place?
Okay, no, that's fair enough. I mean, there have been discussions in other countries around it, but at the same time, I don't think that that's a completely accurate measure because, and here's why, there were certain things that other countries have done for a long time that Bermuda hasn't done. So I think to hold us up to that same threshold as if we have to do what other countries are doing. So for example, Eron, we don't have a minimum wage in Bermuda. When we look at our counterparts, perhaps the United States, even the United States, the UK, a lot of other nations that we are in contact with regularly and where we exchange people regularly, they've had minimum wages, livable wages. They've had things like that for years. Bermuda has never had one of those. So, for example, to implement something like that would be unusual. It would be something that other countries haven't done in the sense that they've done it a long time ago. But for us, I don't think that it's always an appropriate measure because we've said ourselves that there are many things that we should have done a long time that we haven't done at all. Something like legalizing or legislating recreational cannabis. A few other countries have done it, but is that really something where we have to look and judge against other countries in order to make such a decision? It's rational. It's a logical decision.
Even when you look at it from a Bermuda context, right? When you break down the word revolutionary and you look at who has been historically advantaged in Bermuda, when you look at the white establishment in Bermuda, let's be frank, as the premier said, let's put all cards on the table. When he legislates, if that's just a hypothetical situation, he legislates that, it's not just a, oh, okay, well, that's the law. There is going to be pushback. And that is the premise of the word revolutionary. It will need to be a revolt. Will it become a revolt if the government is leading that charge? If the government is saying to the people, hey, look, this is what we're going to do for you? It's not going to be, I understand the hesitance. I understand the resistance to it because the reality is there will be a pushback from private businesses. You just cannot mandate a reduction in interest rates and not expect to have a protracted and expensive legal battle. So yes, it's not, we may look at them as simple ideas, Ryan, to sit there and say, well, yeah, it's natural that we want to make the decision, but it's not just the decision that makes something revolutionary. It's the consequences of that decision and what you have to go through in order to actually see that change. Making the decision part is easy. It's the consequences to it. These are politicians. They have an interest. They have a political interest. You know, I don't think that they intend to go anywhere anytime soon. I think that much of the elected officials, and that may be something we can discuss too, intend to run again. And the reality is, the views that when they were our age, some of the things that we're asking them to consider were never envisaged when they were our age, right? And the pushback that a premier, and I understand it's a difficult situation, hence why I didn't expect a different response when I asked him, hey, are you going to legislate it? I needed to ask that question to prove this point, that you know what? Even in the height of a pandemic and having little to no other options, you still are hesitant to effect change. And that, to me, speaks volumes to the fact that it is a revolutionary matter. And I don't criticize the premier in his personal capacity for taking those considerations or taking those relevant matters into consideration. They are relevant consideration. I just think that we have to really look at it and say, well, what are we going to do? We have no other options. And when you had a 24-11 majority before in the House of Assembly, when you had that majority, you weren't prepared to take it. Now we're in a situation where we still have that majority. We have a higher one than when we started with. And the reality is, in the midst of having no other options, we're still backpedaling to say that we're not going to continue it. And there's got to be a reason there. There's got to be a
totally there, Eron. I mean, what I'm thinking about is sort of, if the standard is to not take steps that need to be taken, if the standard is to talk and not do, if the standard is to not implement changes, which everybody agrees we should implement, but everybody has been perhaps either too afraid or too hesitant to implement. If that is the standard, then veering away from that, going away from the status quo, then I guess that is quite revolutionary. So you're right in that regard, but I do think that's a bit shameful. If the standard, if everybody, and I think it's sad in a way that throughout this pandemic, and we've done 6 or 7 shows, I think right now, every single time that we've gone live, the comments have been, we need to do things differently. We need to think outside the box. When is it going to come? And I'm just wondering, well, what's everybody doing then? Because if everybody agrees that there's a lot that we should have been doing before this, is this normal? How long have we been living like this? Where we've looked at something, looked at a problem, identified a solution, and sat on it and said, well, we should probably do that, and then not do it. And then, like you said, even in the midst of a global pandemic, situations could not be worse. I've spoken to young Bermudians today who have said, I have nothing to lose. All of the fears that we had before, all of the quote unquote comforts that we thought we had before are completely out of the window because we cannot go any lower than this. In an unprecedented pandemic, I certainly would agree. Some people would say it's dramatic. A year ago, people would have said it's dramatic. But I don't understand. I don't know what other event could happen short of aliens coming down and attacking us that would justify the need for us to think outside the box. And those are comments.
It's not about the thinking outside the box, because we'll happily say, well, we're going to consult, or hey, look, we've got this particular panel or this particular commission. It's not about thinking outside the box. We know what our options are. And I think that's an appropriate time to inject this question from our audience, from Miss Lynette Ferbert, who says, are people too comfortable or too afraid? And that is a pointed question. Comfortable or are we too afraid? There are consequences to making the decisions that we're asking to be made. There are criticisms to be made. For example, Bermuda, the image, we talked about that not being congruent with what we know our cultural roots to be, particularly when looking at places like North Hamilton. For me to propose a question to the CEO of the Bermuda Tourism Authority, hey, do you want to have recreational cannabis? He's got to think about that. He's really got to think about what that does to the image that we've promulgated out to the world. There are consequences to it. There is heat to that effect. Right. So do I understand it? Yes. But again, it's one of those questions, are we too comfortable or are we too afraid? And I think that having these discussions, asking the questions as we do to the premier and his colleagues at the press conferences, it gets people talking about issues that, for instance, were made uncomfortable to talk about. Particularly, even the premier on live television having to answer a question, are you going to legislate that? That's an enormous bit of pressure, because when you say yes and you get off that press conference, you've got somebody at the bank. And I asked him, I followed up with him and I said to him, well, are you at all, is the government at all in a compromised or less desirable position to mandate or go into the bank with head held high and say, hey, look, we're mandating a reduction in interest rates, when in actual fact, the government is itself a borrower?
Mm-hmm. I think you froze. I think Eron froze for a little bit there. But I think one of the points that he was making, and we'll get him back shortly. And in the meantime, I'd appreciate some of the comments if you have any feedback. But I think what Eron was getting at there was sort of this conflict between not making decisions that we need to make, sort of considering a question, considering a proposed solution, and then not implementing it. So going back to some of the comments that Judith Parsons and others were saying, is it fear? Is it comfort? What is it that's preventing us from going further? What is preventing us from making the decisions that we need to make? Are people too comfortable or too afraid? And these are conversations that are really people driven. So when Eron goes into a press conference and he talks about certain questions and he asks and he questions the Premier on statements that he's made, he's not there to attack. He's not there even to necessarily criticize. It's to spark a conversation that we're seeing here on social media, but we haven't had in a long time. And so when we look at these types of discussions, ultimately it has to come back on you, the people. What are we going to do in order to affect change? How are we going to recognize that there have been some long-standing issues in Bermuda and then not go and do what needs to be done to address them? So in considering these types of things, ultimately it falls back on you, the people. So we look forward to your continued commentary. We'll wait a little bit longer to see if Eron comes back. I'd like to take some questions and some comments from the public. But ultimately, we've had a great discussion today so far between Glenn Jones. We've had a conversation with Eron Hill, and we've talked a little bit about some of the changes and some of the things that we need to make. One of the common threads that I thought that we began to see was leadership. We see comments here. Canet Ireland Empress Burgess says that a true leader isn't scared. Leaders, like entrepreneurs, are risk takers. And I think that's exactly what we're talking about here. At the beginning of this pandemic, the immediate response was surrounding safety and survival and how we're going to protect ourselves from this virus. And indeed, that's continued discussion that we're continuing to have. We still are navigating this crisis. We don't know when it will end. However, as people have started to go hungry, as bills are piling up, as difficult decisions have begun to be made, we now have to come out of a honeymoon phase and we have to go back into a conversation around how are we going to come out of this? How are we going to fix this? And I think that's part of what the conversations we were having on today surrounded. So we're working to get Eron back. We're looking forward to some continued feedback from you. But in the meantime, I'd like to talk a little bit about the press conference last night, some of the positives. I mean, we saw Dr. Karika Weldon presented to the public for the first time. She'd done some interviews in the past, but we had her on stage at government's press conference last night. And I think it was truly remarkable to see somebody like Dr. Karika Weldon on stage. That is a great example of doing things differently. Who would have imagined, firstly, who would have imagined a global pandemic outbreak in 2020? I don't think that's something that anybody saw coming. But who would have imagined that the person to come back, volunteer their time, and make a contribution, an enormous contribution in setting up a test center, would have been somebody who's under the age of 30. That's Dr. Karika Weldon. We've seen Dr. Kevin Miners and Aaron Evans and other young Bermudians really step up and support the change and support this government's response to this crisis. And I think that's a perfect example in a positive way of some of the things that we've done differently, some of the extraordinary measures that have continued to be made. So I think ultimately, you know, I want to give a shout out to Dr. Karika Weldon and other young Bermudians because they are in many ways the ones who have to drive the change forward. When we're looking at things like recreational cannabis and reviving our tourism industry, when we're looking at things like Queendom Heights, which is Jade Gibbons, the young lady who started photographing Bermuda and said, hold the pink sand. We want to change that image. We want to look at the authentic experiences of Bermudian people, and we want to showcase that. These are prime examples of young Bermudians who are driving change forward and really doing what needs to be done in order to make sure that when we come back into the aftermath of this pandemic, we're really looking to see how we're going to do things differently. So ultimately, I think that's a matter for the Bermudian people to decide. How far are we willing to go with this? How long will we put up with this? At what point do we encourage our government and our people to really step up? Some of us may be very comfortable, but others are not comfortable at all. We've seen thousands of people who are out of work. And so as we navigate this scenario, and we got Eron back, so I did some pretty good.
I think my service provider heard me talking there and said, we ain't got no rent.
We got to put a hold on that. I was just talking a little bit about how one of the things that we're going to need to do in order to do things differently is really emphasize our young Bermudian talent. You were talking about how it's a people-driven decision, and how when we look at the premier and you're asking questions, you weren't asking the questions just to hear his answer. You were asking to encourage the Bermudian people and the general public to think about what needs to be done in order to enact this change. So I use the example of people like Dr. Kariko Weldon, who would have imagined that, firstly, that we would have had a global pandemic, but secondly, that the person to come back and set up a testing site and help coordinate government's response would have been somebody under the age of 30. And then you look at the other young Bermudians helping out, like Aaron Evans and Dr. Kevin Marnus. And then we talk and tied that into our conversation with Glenn Jones and tourism and sort of changing Bermuda's image. Jay Gibbons from Queendom Heights, that's another young Bermudian who has taken a drastic step to say, I'm not happy with the way that Bermuda looks right now. I'm not happy with the way that we're living, and I want to authentically demonstrate how we should be doing things differently.
No, yeah, I think all of those young people are to be commended for their efforts, particularly during this pandemic. We've seen Jade at various press conferences, and she's also been throughout the island documenting, and I think that's an important part of our history, what will become of our history, no doubt an important time of our history where we're going to be determining, as we say, where do we chart our course from here. And I think that Jade, particularly at Queendom Heights, has done an amazing job there at documenting it. And hopefully we can see some representation of some of the things that she documents and takes with respect to the Bermuda Tourism Authority and their, what I hope to be reinvigorated approach, and how do we look to get a different demographic to Bermuda. I know that previously the BTA had contemplated, as we discussed with Glenn earlier, getting African Americans back. I thought you had a very pointed and important question when you asked, well, hey, why aren't we focusing on Africa and the Caribbean? And to be quite frank, I expected Glenn to say something to, particularly when we're looking at Africa, to him to say, well, the distance is why we aren't focusing on that. But he didn't. I thought that he entertained that thought. He said that he would go back with his team. So we're grateful to him in that regard. And certainly, I think that's where it's incumbent upon us not to just have the questions and the criticisms and the critiques during these discussions, but also to follow up. One of the things I was going to say to Glenn, and he hinted at it, he says, well, Aaron, I imagine that after this, you're going to send me an influx of information as to why. And absolutely, I will. And I think Glenn knows me enough to know that that is something that we'll do. And I know Glenn enough to know it's something that he will take back and consider. Whether or not he'll make a decision on this is a totally different thing, because you don't make unilateral decisions as a CEO. So I thought his responses were appropriate. But like I said, I appreciate that he's at least expressed a willingness to take those on board. And if, for instance, he is desirous or considering taking the full-time position, I think something I hope that he's taken away from our discussion, particularly the feedback from the guests, is that in order to do that, he's going to have to entertain new ideas, to think outside of the box. And again, that goes right back to the heart of the Bermuda Tourism Board. That's one question that we didn't get to ask him, because the government made an announcement not too recently when the full-time CEO, Mr. Kevin Dallas, had resigned, that there were going to be, or just prior to it, that there were going to be some decisions being made for changes to that board. So be particularly it does now, recognizing that, hey, look, tourism is shut. And if they wanted to do away with, let's say, the Bermuda Tourism Authority, some might say, well, what better time to do it than now when they're not generating any funds, particularly. But then you got to look at the important job and role that they play. So there's a balance to be struck there. And really, we just got to keep our eyes to see what happens.
You sort of sparked an interesting thought, and that was sort of the current timing, right? In times of crisis, a lot of people rush and run to any semblance of stability, and so they're hesitant to change. So in a lot of ways, for example, we've seen certain leaders and certain people step up, and we know that, you know, even if we weren't particularly satisfied with maybe their responses, we know that we couldn't, you know, change right now because we want stability. We see in the United States and things like that, you know, during war times, for example, they refuse to change their president quite often because they want that sense of stability and comfort. Is that potentially one of our downfalls here? Are we drawing to the old, the same old? Do we need to get rid of this notion that we need to continue to stay the course that we're on now, particularly during a time of crisis?
Well, I think what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that, for instance, maybe people feel that because we're in a time of crisis and, you know, now is an important time of our history, that we need not make a change, particularly when it comes to our elected officials. Is that
all the unity talk, and, you know, we just have
right. Well,
you know,
I don't think that. I think
comments and do certain things because we have to stay the course and stay together and get through this first.
you can unifiedly, you can have a sense of unity and walk right off of a cliff, Ryan. And so the reality is that the unity, it is important if we're going in the right direction. And I think that's what these discussions are saying, where we don't see the direction as yet. We hope to see it soon, and we hope that it's pointing in a direction that entertains ideas that we previously didn't before. So I think the unity talk really comes from a political cage view of, hey, I don't want to be attacked, and I'm going to use this as a shield. And then like Glenn said that quote about never let a good crisis go to waste. I mean, realistically, I would hate to say that some politicians will manipulate the current crisis to their advantage, but the reality is politicians will be politicians. We as the listening public have to be critical for those realities. We have to be able to see when we think that's happening, identify whether or not that is happening, and really make our decisions not based on where we are, but where do we need to go and who's going to take us there. And I think part of those discussions, Ryan, we're both supporters of the Progressive Labour Party. There's no secret about that, but we can still be highly critical of our government in the hopes that they will take those considerations on board and make appropriate decisions. As you said to me earlier or last time we were on the show, you're highly critical of me all the time. I still consider you to be one of my supporters. And the reality of it is, if I was in a position to make decisions, those are the types of people that we need around us, who are going to question us, who are going to hold us accountable. And I think that one of the things we're hoping to change is this notion that asking questions or being critical is adversarial or unproductive. That's not it. It's about holding our leaders accountable. What is in the best interest of the people of this country? And that ultimately has to be the test. And we can't hide behind this shield of, well, we need to stay together, we need unity. But the reality of it is, and I see this comment here from Dr. Lou Matthews, shout out to him. He says that unity talk can also be a silencer of needed dissonance, needed ideas, needed discomfort. It's hard to think outside of the box if all we're worried about is the comfort of unity. And I don't think I could have personally said it any better.
Yeah, somebody needs to put that in a book, Eron. I mean, it follows right along the line of what we've been talking about this whole time, which is, you know, to a degree, you do have to stay together to protect yourselves and right the ship and survive. But beyond that, unity does not mean silence. It doesn't mean a failure to question. Those are the types of things we need to think about. And so when we talk about that unity talk, we can be united and still disagree. And I think that's one thing as a community that we've yet to fully grasp, is that we have to actually be able to understand that we're on the same team, but we're not always going to agree on the same course. I mean, look at us. I'm sure you and I want the best for Bermuda and for everybody, and we want to have a balanced and fair perspective. But you and I often don't agree, as you mentioned earlier. That doesn't mean that we're not united, but it means that we're willing to hold ourselves accountable. We're willing to do things differently, and we understand that iron sharpens iron. So thank you, Dr. Lou Matthews, for that comment. I mean, if only other people thought like that, perhaps we would be even in a much better position.
Well, my thing to that, and this is actually for my own edification, I want to know, Ryan, what do you do in circumstances where your question was, okay, well, some people feel that we've got to maintain a certain unity in a certain course, right? Ryan, what do we do? And I've been in this position where I've been highly critical of the government and quite frankly, frustrated at sometimes. But I've also been on the front lines of asking young people to vote for this particular government. And they did. They came out in droves and they voted this government in with an overwhelming majority and mandate. But now, recognizing, let's say that they don't make the decisions that we're saying that they should make, Ryan. What do we do as supporters of the Progressive Labour Party come next year or the year after when an election is called? What do we say to young people? Really? What do we say if, particularly bearing in mind your question of unity and togetherness, what do we say if the same leaders are in place and they've made clear by that time that thinking outside of the box and the decisions that, you know, we think ought to be made aren't on the table? As the Premier said, everything's on the table. What do we say to our peers? Because there's this notion that you can't tell them to not vote for the PLP. And if not, what do you do?
The results speak for themselves, Eron. I mean, I don't think there were a lot of people that went out and told people not to vote for the PLP in 2012.
No. Let's be very specific. Let's say we're in 2022. There's an election today. The Premier has said today, or let's today, right now, he said that everything's on the table. In 2022, when the election is called, there have been no changes to the elected representative. They're running the same. They are our party. They have not made the decisions that we thought they should make.
And what I'm telling you is the people in the past have demonstrated that when they feel that way, they will show it.
No, not what the people say that not what the people have done. What do we do? Because we're trying to chart a different course for young people. You and I, for the other
what we're doing right now. I mean, people are looking at people like you and me to help lead the change. We've recognized that it's young Bermudians that have to step up. There's sort of a misconception, or maybe not a misconception. There's a sentiment among particularly young Bermudians that older Bermudians are afraid to challenge themselves and hold themselves accountable. And I think there is some merit to that statement, that we've been so stuck in our ways, right, when it comes to, for example, things like segregation, that we've been afraid to challenge our own leaders. And I think that that's something that people like you and me have to contrast. And a lot of people are confused right now. I would imagine even if the premier himself were watching this, he would be asking questions like, whose side are these guys on? Because we're going out here and we're telling you openly, we support the Progressive Labour Party. We're very cordial and friendly. And we've even, you and I both were on the campaign trail in 2000, what was the last election? 2017, and the lead up to it. So how can we be on the campaign trail for the Progressive Labour Party and then get up here on a show and criticize some of the decisions that are being made? And the answer to that, Eron, is that unity does not mean silence. Our strength is in our diversity of opinion. Our strength is in our ability to be independent thinkers and have balanced commentary and to call things out when we see it. Because if we're going to accept, right, that in Bermuda, there's this divide whereby if people who are traditionally supporters of the OBA criticize the PLP, that those criticisms get thrown out the window. And if people who are PLP supporters that criticize the OBA, their criticisms will get thrown out the window. So we're only looking then to our own people to criticize us. If I don't ever take on any commentaries of my detractors or people who will never get my support, then that means unless my own supporters criticize me and hold me accountable, then nobody will. So to answer your question specifically, in order for us to react to this situation and in order for us to hold ourselves accountable, we have to do things exactly like what we're doing now, which is ask the tough questions that other people may get flack for asking, hold people accountable when they say they're going to do something and don't do it, and furthermore, drive the change forward and encourage other young Bermudians to do the same.
Right. We've got a comment here from Ferrari Woods that says, get involved or start a new party. What are your thoughts on that? And that was, I think, the premise of the question, is saying, what do we do if they haven't made the decision? It's fine and dandy for us to have these discussions. And I take on board what Mr. Woods has said there, right? And I think that is part and parcel of what we're doing, is getting involved, being a voice for the young people. What do we do in situations where it's now election time all over again? We're not ready to be candidates as yet, if that's a decision that you want to make. What do you do as far as the advice for young people? If you're a thought leader in the community and somebody comes and says, these guys haven't made the decision, is it something where you say, and I'll give you some options here. Let me help you out there, right? Let's say, for instance, I say to somebody, well, let's vote them in. So because we know that, for example, the other side, the opposition historically hasn't shown us that they align with our interests. And then let's sort out our house, right? Let's sort out our house afterwards. And that, to me, is that same unity talk of, well, look, now is the time for unity. And then after an election is not the time to make a drastic change in leadership. We've seen what's happened there. That's happened. So I think, what do you think about this notion of, if these guys, when I say these guys, the current administration don't make some of these radical decisions, what do you think about the notion of a new party?
Well, at the end of the day, every party is driven by the people. A party means nothing unless it's comprised of individuals who are willing to hold themselves accountable, be independent thinkers, and not fall into this sort of cult-like mentality where we can't challenge each other. There's no use in a new party if they're going to adopt the same old methods of failing to challenge each other. I do think there is merit to considering different organizations. But ultimately, I mean, for me, one of the reasons that I'm a supporter of the Progressive Labour Party is because I believe in their aims. The vehicle is just fine to me. It's the people in it where we get ourselves messed up, because we don't work with each other. We don't know how to hold each other accountable while remaining connected. And so those are the types of issues that we're having. I don't think that necessarily it's a matter of a party. I mean, if people want to do that, then I'd encourage them, because I think we could use competition right now. But my specific advice, Eron, because I want to answer this question for other young Bermudians out there who are wondering what they should do, is find your niche, find out where your abilities and your talents can be most useful, and do that. If you as a young Bermudian think that the best way you can contribute to Bermuda is by getting another group of like-minded people together and starting something, then do that. If you think that the best way that you can contribute is by working internally to help change and influence people because you have an opportunity that others don't have, or you're in proximity to influence where others aren't, then do that. If you're completely out of the loop and you feel that your best way of helping is by going on social media and presenting your ideas and challenging people who you've never met before, then do that. And I think that ties in perfectly. I mean, for example, with Future Leaders, right? We made a press release recently because of the fact that a lot of Bermudians were stranded overseas. Our work is mostly here in Bermuda, but we set up a platform for young Bermudians to connect with each other and find a way to return to Bermuda. That was an area which is completely outside of the scope of what we normally do. But because we had the technological infrastructure set up in order to do certain things, we just did it. And so it didn't take any drastic meeting or anything. We just said, hey, can we do this? This is where we can fit in. You have charities like Mirrors who are directly in contact with schools. They were in a position to provide laptops, for example. They just did it. We're not in that position. So we found our niche. So what I would say to Ferrari Wood's comment is, whatever you think is the best way for you to contribute, you do that. But you do it for the right reasons, you do it with the right intentions, and you do it in a way where when that finally starts, or when you get that group of people together, you don't take the same steps and same mistakes of failing to hold each other accountable, or accusing people of being traitors or sellouts or whatever, when they call you out on things you said you would do but haven't done. So that would be my comment, Eron. I don't know if you have anything different to say, or if you want to challenge me on that.
Well, no, I mean, I was hoping that we would really look at, a position of young people today who are frustrated, who have comments, who have, these criticisms and things that they think should be done, and they're not seeing them done. It's easy to tell somebody to get involved. It's easy to tell everybody, let your conscience be your guide. Mm-hmm. The reality is that if we've got an interest to see certain things happen, they're looking to us for leadership, and that leadership isn't do as you please or do as you. The reality is hey, well, okay, well, this is the plan, and I don't know. I don't know the answer to the question that I asked, and that's why I was asking, because I'm hoping for some guidance, and we put that out there to the community. Is what position, for example, does a young person, what do they do when they're in the position of saying, okay, well, I support this party, but they're actually, you said that you support the party because of the aims. Well, if the actual vehicle isn't matching up with those aims, then at what point do we say, one, we've got to get involved, but if we're not yet ready to get involved, what do we advise other young people to do at that particular moment? And that to me is there's an evolving answer there that I think that comes with experience. It comes with time. I don't know the answer to it. I was hoping to get some guidance from that. But we leave that with our viewers, and as we've always got after these discussions is some feedback from individuals within the community. But I think it's an important decision, particularly when we're sitting here and saying, well, we've got to be highly critical, but critique only goes so far. Yes, we've got to get involved. We've got to demand that change. But again, when we're sitting there to young people and saying, well, what decision do you make if the party whose aims you're saying you support isn't aligning with those aims, with the decisions that they make? So that's an evolving question, something that, again, we will leave to our viewers, and we'll come to discuss on coming series as we have different guests and the like, potentially as we look to have some former leaders of the country on this show. And we'll ask them some of their guidance, because hindsight is 2020. I think we've gone a little over our hour and a half, which is our scheduled timing for these shows. We want to again express our extreme gratitude to Mr. Glenn Jones, the interim CEO of the Bermuda Tourism Authority, for his time today. Again, it's been another interesting series, another opportunity to discuss what is an important decision that has to be made for Bermuda as to how do we recover with our tourism industry. What is that going to look like?
I mean, I've seen a common theme in our discussions today. Although we've touched on a lot of different things, we've talked about young Bermudians, we've talked about tourism, we've talked about regional unity, we've talked about country unity. We've talked a little bit about private businesses and the tit for tat that's going on right now between, for example, Butterfield Bank and the premier or private industry and the private sector. as well as government. But I'm seeing a common thread here, which is surrounding leadership and the ability to think and act outside the box. And so I want to just reiterate this comment here by my friend Canet Island Empress Burgess, who commented.
Got it done.
Got it done. And we look forward to seeing your comments in the future, Canet, which was that tough times call for leaders to always think outside the box, be creative, research, rely on key stakeholder input, and rely on non-traditional methods while listening to the ideas of the people. And I think that's a pretty good quote to wrap up with, along with the one that Dr. Lou Matthews mentioned earlier, because it really is a time for us to reflect and consider us as a people, what we view as accountability and unity, and how we balance those two things. And, you know, this pandemic, it's going to last for quite some time. This is not, we've seen our reality has set in. We've been on lockdown for over a month. We've just come out of it. And I think we're starting to grasp the reality that this is not something that's going to be a couple of weeks from now or even months from now. We're looking at perhaps another year even of trying to navigate this crisis. And certainly the depth is something that will take years to repay back. So as we start to have these conversations and we start to understand that this is our reality right now, those are the types of things we have to think about. What are we asking for from our leaders? Because ultimately, they're guided by us. They're accountable to the people. And so it's for the people to step up and have these types of conversations. So, Eron, I'm grateful that you and I were able to go back and forth and have a debate today. I'm grateful for Glenn Jones for coming on and allowing us to pick his brain. As I said earlier, he said, don't go easy on us. And I don't think that we did. I think we asked some very serious and important questions, which he's going to go back and reflect on. And we're looking forward to seeing what he comes up with. And thanks again to the general public. Your comments ultimately guide this discussion as well as your questions. We are on every Tuesday and Thursday. We have some more interesting guests coming up. So thanks again. Thank you very much. Eron, do you have any final comments?
No, until next time.
Until next time. Thanks again to our essential workers. We send our condolences and thoughts and prayers with not only the families of those impacted by the pandemic, but the current missing person who's out there. So thanks again. We look forward to seeing you on Tuesday, and stay safe in the meantime.